I'm Geoff McGhee. I'm the creative director for the Bill Lane Center for the American West, which is a research, teaching, and public engagement center at Stanford University. We were founded by two history professors, but our goal is to look at the totality of the North American West, the past in terms of history, the present in terms of journalism and public policy, and the future in terms of scientific modeling and prediction. We have a very strong emphasis on data analysis and visualization, both as a tool for historical scholarship, but also for public policy analysis and the types of journalism projects we do. And of course, I don't need to point out that it is very important and useful to people who are working in natural science, climate, and other civil engineering types of areas that we work in. Of course, water is very important in the American West because there's not very much of it and there's a lot of people and there's going to be more. One of the most recent data journalism projects that we did here at my center is we wanted to do a survey of media, and especially the type of access to media that people have in rural America. And in order to take a sort of census of media in America, we scraped a database from the Library of Congress that contained 150,000 records, showing every newspaper published in the United States, daily, weekly, monthly even, from 1690 to about 2008, 2009. And we plotted this on a map and added a time series to it. And this was going to be the entree to a second phase of the project that we're working on now, where we're actually taking the digitized text from those newspapers and looking for historical patterns in the type of coverage. But for this project, what we were really looking at is the state of news availability to people in small communities, particularly in the West. And what this visualization did was it let you step through the major epochs of American journalism, from the colonial era up to the present, and that was coupled with an analysis that I wrote of rural newspapers and how they've done much better in terms of surviving the onslaught of free online competition, of consolidation in the industry, and shrinking newsrooms. And so that was an interesting sort of counterpoint to the state of mainstream media. But I think the other thing was that it showed how the type of relationship that a small publication has to a small community can be a very intimate one. And that is in some ways being mirrored by the way that publications are using social media and other ways of engaging with their audience, user-generated content for that matter. Some of the things that I think were effective about it were that we left in a fair amount of metadata for each publication so that you could see that there was actually a tremendous amount of non-English publications published in the U.S. since before its founding. In fact, there was a fork in the road. I think it was Benjamin Franklin published a newspaper in both German and English. And German newspapers were quite common in the U.S. until about the First World War, and I don't need to explain why that might have been the case, that they went into decline after that. But also Japanese, Chinese, Finnish, Norwegian, Russian, Italian, and French, especially down in the Louisiana area. So it was a really interesting way of looking at things, and also we posted the data to Fusion tables so that you can download it and use it yourself. The type of information that would have been really nice to have would actually be the circulation figures for all these publications. And in fact, that information can be found in hardbound volumes that are about 50 pounds each and were published every year for many decades. I think that this is a classic example of a database being made visual. This was over about 300 years, you had 150,000 entries. And in any given year in the 20th century, you're likely to encounter about 40,000 publications per year in the U.S. And so it's very important to be able to see the spatial patterns in aggregate. What you really see is the growth of the United States as the frontier expanded westward. And that was both that was both reported on and also encouraged by the existence of these newspapers. Let me a sec. The other thing that was harder to do was because of the scale of the data, the performance of the visualization was not as lightning quick as we would like. So what we did instead was create a video capture of an animation of the entire time series, sliced and diced by different categories, language, frequency of publication. And we posted those to Vimeo as videos that you could download and really get a sense by scrubbing back and forth as to what the patterns look like over time. And I think that while this is a project that is as much about historical scholarship and research as it is about contemporary journalism, I think there's lessons there to be learned as we start to deal with data sets that go down to the record level. They're not just summary statistics, but in fact you're dealing with a lot of data points, and you've got to figure out how can you present them to the user in case they have an interest in drilling down to a specific record, but still maintain performance, in some cases, privacy, confidentiality, or proprietary information, although that seems to be the least of the concerns these days. Well, there were a lot of flaws in the data. The Library of Congress, which is based in Washington, of course, is working in partnership with state and university libraries around the country. They're going through old microfilms and stacks even of dusty printed volumes, trying to really take an inventory of all of journalistic communication in the United States over 300 years. It's a huge project. And there's a lot of duplication. There's some errors in entries. And in fact, in order for the visualization to work, which is based on logical rules, you needed to have at least a 4-digit year for the start date of the publication. That is, so that every year that you would animate through, you would want to know, did that publication exist or not? And you need a 4-digit date to show either that it's still publishing or that it ceased publication in some particular year. When you have 7 digits, let's say you've got 1889 to 1960, don't know, then you have some problems. And so what we had to do was go back and in fact, on the first pass, we were missing about 30% of the data was unclassifiable. So what we did was we did another round of scraping where we looked at the collections, the library collections, and we were able to see the minimum holdings that they had. Like, this is a microfilm of this issue. It exists. It's in our collection. And we would take that date and we would say, okay, well, at least that frames us. We have a minimum proof of existence. We can't say definitively that it stopped publication right after that, unless we had some indication that that was the case. But that let us at least define a range and then get those into a again a rules-based logical presentation. And within a certain margin of error, I think it was worth it. We used a lot of open source software, Python scripts to scrape the information. And MySQL databases to store the information, which we then generated as just a comma-separated text file, which was actually about, I think it was about 16 megabytes uncompressed was our data file. But at that point, then we built the GUI in Flash, actually using Flash Builder or Flex. And we took advantage of a lot of the code libraries that are available that have been developed over the years. One is a projection library that lets you plot information using the conic polar projection that is typically used for the U.S., which means mathematically replotting all the Latin long points, but also a zip library that lets Flash open and uncompress zip archived files, and that enabled us to shrink the data set down to about 3 megabytes, which is still pretty big, but it's a lot smaller. And then Flex was the main authoring tool we used for this. And I've done a fair amount of Flash over the years, but this was my first time using the more industrial grade integrated development environment called Flex, which is preferred by most people with a background in programming here. We work with computer science students from Stanford because it's the same type of app you would use to develop in Java or in Objective-C. Right. But for my part, I found that it made it much more challenging to art direct the project and really control the appearance of visual objects. You're more levels removed from the visual presentation than you would be in, say, Flash Professional. That said, you have many of the same problems working in HTML or HTML5, that there isn't necessarily an integrated design or development environment where you can do sort of WYSIWYG editing of your display. Instead, you're mostly working in text editors. You're integrating different technologies like JavaScript, CSS, and the various code libraries that one uses, like be it OpenLayers or jQuery, etc. So it may be that working in Flex was a good preparation for the future that we have in the HTML-based interactive visualization world. That it can vary for static printed visualizations, of course. I could talk about another project I did that's more journalistic. In 2008, for the U.S. presidential elections, I was working at Le Monde at the time in France, and my job was to explain the American electoral process and provide updates on the state of the race to a French audience. Some of the things that might not be immediately apparent to a non-American audience is the importance of the states as individual battlegrounds in the contest. A horse race that shows the national level polling between McCain and Obama. What we wanted to do was show that the real prize is how many states you can win and what those different states are worth. And so what I did was I used an aggregate of different state-level polls to indicate which way each state was trending at the time over a time series, so that you could see, even if one of the candidates was leading in the national polling, that in fact the states that they were leading in might give them, or if they were behind in the national polling, that the states that they were leading in might give them an edge in terms of the process by which the winner is determined. And so you could scrub over a time series and see how, as states were deemed to be leaning one way or the other, you could see the potential for how the race could be really upended, depending on the value of that individual state. And we also felt that we wanted to create a more of a statistical basis of understanding of the character of the different states. So you could click on different categories and look at the relative GDP by state, or poverty level, unemployment, and of course, because this was a historic election in terms of the race of the Democratic candidate, we also showed statistics in terms of what was the ethnicity mix in different states. So the idea was to be sort of this killer app that basically laid out all the information you needed in one place. The problem, I suppose, looking at it, is that it really was an overwhelming amount of information in some ways. And on election night, we used this same map to load in live election results, as we call different states. Just figuring out how to constantly update the data set by adding new state-by-state polling numbers, and then have it load that information in without a lag, because you wanted the interface to be very responsive as you scrubbed over the time series. So, and also to make it easy enough to edit on an ongoing basis. And that was a bit challenging. I had a sort of a structure of an XML document that would get loaded into the Flash that would then explain to the player where the rest of the data was. So if there was a new data set, it would see it immediately and then load that into. But only when you actually navigated to that point in the time series. And when you did that, it had to initialize the map, and so there's a bit of a lag there, and that's kind of frustrating. Right. Part of that, I think, is because we didn't have access to an underlying database server where we could send queries and dynamically load them. And I think using some kind of combination of AJAX and so asynchronous data calls, we might have been able to do a more elegant job on that. And I think that's always a big question, like I was talking about with the newspaper project, is you want to be able to provide the answer to a very greedy query, like give me all records. But then you also want to be sure that you can find a way to maintain performance for the people who, are not going to be needing to see everything. I think Flash is dominant in the way that internal combustion engines are dominant on the roads. I think we know that it is a technology that time and logic has passed by. The idea of an alien sort of runtime, a plugin running in your browser, especially when browsers are being installed in more and more things. Maybe we'll have a browser in the front of our refrigerator in a few years. It seems like having basic web standards is more important than ever. In the PC era, maybe it didn't matter so much. In fact, it was wonderful having Flash operate the same across all PC platforms. But it had a lot of overhead, and I know that Flash does make a person's computer sweat pretty hard sometimes. I don't think that's necessarily Adobe's fault. I think that's as much we're not. There's a lot of non-programmers doing, developing apps that are not necessarily very responsible in terms of how they use computer resources. I'm sure I've been guilty of that too. That I might throw a few extra processor cycles at something rather than thinking through how to do something most efficiently.
Right.
But I think that a lot of the, someone who's experienced in Flash, I think JavaScript will appear familiar in many ways, and I'm very optimistic that more and more tools will be coming along that will make it easier and more democratic for people to create HTML-based interactive visualizations. So I think that Apple's decision to not support Flash in the iPhone or the iPad was really a very dramatic and almost kind of game-changing decision on their part that, at the same time, I think hastened a process that was probably going to happen sooner or later anyway. Because in a sense, you had a segregation of things that the browser did. You had the basic web pages that you loaded, and then you had these sort of apps that would load in the browser, and it was a very strange ecosystem to have. And it was really a Band-Aid. It was a very good one. But the reason that Flash was so successful is because HTML was terribly neglected for more than a decade. If anything, that's my pushback to people who complain that Flash is not, web friendly. It's not. But the web was not multimedia friendly for a very long time. And Flash stepped into the fray and gave us a wonderful tool, one that has not been equaled by any other competitor or alternative in any way, and may never be. I did want to talk about a project that I thought was less successful, visualization, and this was leading up to the European Parliament elections in 2009. Was it? I think. Isn't that right? The European parliamentary elections in 2009, when there were going to be people electing deputies to send to Brussels. But voters all across the European Union nations were going to go to the polls or not, to elect deputies to go to Brussels and represent them in the European Parliament. And so what we wanted to do leading up to that election, one of the interactives we did was sort of a game that said, what do Euro deputies do? Which is a little sad that, the state of the European project is at the point that people still didn't really know what their representatives did. But in fairness, it is a sort of an extra sovereign kind of organization. The other thing we wanted to do was to show the state of the economies of the different members of the European Union. And so what we did was we created a kind of an economic atlas that let you view various summary statistics for each nation, the level of debt, their annual deficit for the previous year, their GDP per year, the unemployment rates. Let me see, what are the other ones? I think I wrote them down somewhere. But anyway, we tried to make it pretty flexible. It was a visualization where you could toggle between bar chart view or bubble maps, like a bubble plot showing graduated circles, or a choropleth where it was doing value by color. But there wasn't really, when we indicated the highs and the lows and tried to make it graphically clear who was doing, how different countries were doing relative to each other. But there wasn't really a story to it. And I think that while there's nothing wrong with doing a sort of atlas-type treatment, which is sort of more of a reference tool, I think that we need to remember that in newsrooms we're really answering a need for up-to-date information to tell people what's going on, and not necessarily tell them what's not going on. I think that there needs to be more annotation and intervention in terms of the journalism. I think one way to do that is to provide a list of, let's say, bookmarks that you can click through, and then by clicking on that, it will take the visualization to a preset state, maybe the zoom level, maybe the visualization type, and then provide some annotation that gives you a little bit of a story. And I think it would have been much more successful then, and it wouldn't have been that much harder to do. I think it's very unfair to judge visualizations on a scale of narrative effectiveness when we know so little often about the intentions of the creator. I don't think that flight patterns was necessarily created in order to promote awareness of the American air traffic system, but instead was a way of saying, look, it is now possible for us to know the location of every airplane in the sky, and there's thousands of them at every time point throughout the day, and you can see the patterns that emerge as East Coast people wake up early and get on transcontinental flights, and then a few hours later, those almost like Missile Command or something, those planes start emerging from the West Coast and heading back east, and then lastly, those flights that take off for Hawaii. And it's very moving and interesting. And in fact, there are things in the static visualizations as you get closer to different regions that you can see the patterns, like the fact that much of, I think, parts of California and Nevada are completely off limits to airplanes. Or the incredible amount of activity that goes on for the sake of FedEx and overnight package delivery in the Southeast. So I think there's more of an exploratory visualization than something that had a point. And I am a very strong proponent of us coming up with a better way of providing metadata for visualizations as we pass them around, since social media has been the salvation of information graphics. Information graphics have not done that well online in the context of big news sites that don't know where to put them or how to promote them. But social media takes these extraordinary pieces and shares them around so that people can finally see them. And there's a cultural movement coming with that, and I think that's great. The problem is that they're often stripped out of context. We don't know who made them, why they made them, where they got the data, what kind of data is it? Is it something extraordinarily new and groundbreaking, in which case maybe the data is really the star and not the visualization. Some visualizations are really looking at things we've known all along, maybe even the fact that there's 3,000 flights or however many in the U.S., but we've never seen it before. We've never seen it like that. And that kind of visualization really opens our eyes. And sometimes there's visualizations that take things that we know very well, but then look at them in a new way. I think it's funny because if you look at the original map of the London Underground that used the circuit board diagram, even now, almost I don't know, probably 8 decades later, we're seeing applications of that seem so obvious, but nobody thought to do them before. The interstate highway system in the United States. Somebody recently did that in the style of the London Underground. And even more important than that is a series of maps of American rivers that show the relationships of rivers and their tributaries, which, because of the way gravity works and the way topography works, hydrology maps are almost always quite complicated and hard to read. And here was one that's just absolutely magnificent in the sense that it just explains it all without cheating. I mean, it's quite accurate. In some, I think that there's different grades of visualization and different purposes, and we need to be mindful of that.
All right.
And the extent to which the author can make that clear to the user, that might be useful too, although I think that art projects tend to become less appealing or interesting when they try too hard to explain themselves. So I'm not necessarily advocating that every project has to painstakingly explain everything to you.
Right.
But in journalism, I think you do. One data viz that's quite simple and fairly small that I think is very effective was done by National Geographic magazine in their printed edition a couple of years ago. It showed basically the carbon footprint for wines produced in different regions depending on where you lived in the United States. So it was a map, but it was not in geographic context, really. It was more of a diagram, a flow map showing 4 principal wine-producing regions, Napa in the western U.S., Bordeaux in western France, Australia, and Chile. And then the markets that they looked at were Los Angeles, Chicago, and New York. And what the visualization did was really, it was very elegant, very simple. Used just a very judicious use of iconography, that is the skylines of the three cities, and then just a bottle of wine for each of the wine producing regions that were color coded, so that you could see the arrows emanating from those regions, and then the network diagram that showed how they reached each city. And what was really extraordinary about it was how, in a very quick, and network diagrams are usually quite difficult to unpack, and this one I think was very successful in that way. That you could see that basically wine that's shipped by sea is relatively efficient in terms of carbon, and is not a very environmentally costly way to deliver this product, which is fairly heavy. It's a liquid in a glass bottle in cases. Whereas once it's unpacked from those containers and put on a truck, forget about it. The carbon footprint is enormous. So in fact, if you're living in New York City, it might surprise you to know that you might be drinking French wine because of a smaller carbon footprint than what comes from Los Angeles, which is really extraordinary. And in fact, that includes Australia and Chile are also better alternatives to California wine. Obviously, in the U.S. and in a lot of countries, we've had this discussion about the distribution of wealth and income. And it simply is three consecutive bar charts. And what's interesting is one is a more academic treatment that is probably more logical in the way it lays it out. And the other one is from Mother Jones magazine, which is a very, very fiery, progressive, muckraking, investigative magazine that does some great work. And so they turn the stats around in a way that that make it much more dramatic. So the question is, how is wealth spread around in the U.S.? And it's by three categories: how Americans think it's distributed, how Americans believe it should be distributed, and then this is the forehead slapper, how it really is distributed. And so when you look at the first bar chart, it says, okay, so Americans believe that the top 20% controls half or maybe close to 60% of the wealth in the U.S. And the rest of the other 40% is sort of fairly evenly spread around the other 80% of the population. And they think that that's gotten a little out of hand, and they'd like to reel that in a little bit. Maybe the top 20% should have 30% of the wealth, although I don't know how they become top 20%. That looks like a fairly small. And that the others should basically, in fact, they almost feel like it should be, split into quintiles, which would actually be very hard to actually have classes if they're all basically, some make $60,000, some make $40,000. Anyway, and then there's the reality, which is that the top 20% controls about 84% of the wealth in the United States, and that the second 20%, between the top 40% basically control 96% of the wealth in the U.S., and the other 60% of the population controls 4% of the wealth in the United States. It's a really extraordinary thing about it. And I think the sequencing of the charts in these two examples is interesting, because when you look at the more academic treatment, they lead with the actual distribution of wealth. Then they say what Americans think it is, which is, again, is still fairly skewed towards the top. And then lastly, it says what they would like it to be, which is, basically, even Steven, practically. So it's an interesting contrast of, how someone who's just interested in clearly presenting the information can be different from someone who's coming from a storytelling context where they want to really, really, hit you over the head with this and make a very dramatic mental experience, which I think is a great success of the Mother Jones treatment. We talk about how visualization can access a very high bandwidth input to our brains, that we can develop an impression very quickly. But I think that what is even more interesting is how we can create mental models using visualization that become sort of metaphors for how we understand things. And that those have frequently served us very well in creating sort of national or, human conversations about different topics. And economists, of course, use them all the time. Most Americans don't really understand what bending the cost curve means, but it's a very visceral and real meaning to people working in economic analysis. And I think that as we can create more visual and conceptual illustrations for people, the more we can have nuanced discussions about the issues that confront us and the types of levers that we have to pull on things. In fact, just having that lever, thanks to Thomas Edison or whoever invented the lever, probably going back further than that. I was thinking of electricity, but having the concept of levers actually is an important part of how we understand how much ability an individual has to enact change. And so just imagine like the new metaphors that are waiting to be coined. Another graphic that I think does that very effectively in creating a new mental model is the New York Times' interactive graphic that looks at the unemployment rate. This is from 2009. The only thing that's a shame is that it's not updated anymore, and I can understand that it's probably quite a bit of data crunching that goes into doing it. What they felt was that the U.S. unemployment rate is so monolithic and such a big round number that it's difficult to convey the nuances behind it. And so what they did was they created a very clean, very effective interface that lets you slice and dice the unemployment rate by different education levels, ethnic groups, and ages. And you could see, the first thing I tried to do was to see what the top and the bottom are. And in fact, I think it was women with advanced degrees in their, 30s and 40s, the unemployment rate was like 3% or something like that. But for young black men who hadn't finished high school, it was 50% practically. It was astonishing. That visualization made quite a splash when it came out, I think, in the summer of 2008. It's very provocative. It's a very striking visual form that I think is very successful at getting people to pay attention to it. And it contains an enormous amount of information, both the online version and the printed version. I know that once you get past the initial apparition, which is kind of, very satisfying as an experience, because you can look at the way that these summer blockbuster movies have really taken over the American movie industry, and the type of, the shape of their box office. I remember when movies would come out and they'd stay in the theaters for 6 months or a year or something, and now it seems like they're gone after 2 months, and you kind of see that in these visual forms. These blobs are very squat. It's sort of like Americans, I guess, we've gotten more squat and wide. But then, I realized the second order of examination that bothers a lot of people who are very rigorous about how they convey information is the fact that the forms are all emanating from a center point, so that it's difficult to measure. It's always the case in any sort of stacked area chart that it's difficult to pick out the patterns in an individual trend. But this is pronounced by the fact that it's going in two directions, and you have there are some artifacts of the way that the visualization algorithm works that sort of smooths out the blobs and creates a little bit of distortion there. I'm actually pretty. I'm much less troubled by this graphic than some purists, because I think that because I don't think that it's meant to be used as a form of visual spreadsheet. I wouldn't look up the box office of a particular movie using this graphic, but to see the overall trend and the relative, it's almost like looking at a school of fish, and you've got the big whoppers, and then these tiny little fry that swim in schools together, like the indie movies that come out in the fall. And I think it's interesting, because usually I say that interactive graphics provide more context and analysis than print graphics do. But this is really the opposite, and I think Amanda Cox talks about this. that the printed graphic is really awash in annotation. There's as much text as there is visual forms there. And the text tells a very interesting story of the sort of ecosystem of movies in the U.S. And I guess it's probably global box office, in fact. I'm not sure. Whereas the online graphic provides a lot of depth. You can click on each data point and link to a full reference library that lets you learn everything you want to know about that film. But in terms of understanding the macroeconomic aspects of it, it's less successful in the sense that it doesn't really contain much of that annotation at all. I think that there's a continuum, and I think that the more important the data is, the less important the visualization form is. And the more mundane and quotidian and maybe well understood the data is, the more important the visualization side becomes in terms of putting a new lens on something very familiar and enabling us to see it in a new way. And I think there's some visualizations that are very effective at that. And I think those are oftentimes the ones that are really celebrated. Well, I think the most important tool that's out there right now for data visualization is Tableau, the Windows application that lets you quickly take a spreadsheet or database and apply all sorts of visualization encodings to it. You can rapidly prototype an infographic very, very quickly with Tableau. And it encodes a lot of best practices in terms of layout, design, color use. It's really an extraordinary application and one that we've needed for a long time. In some ways, it's sort of like what Excel should have been doing for the past decade or more, but it hasn't been. Tableau itself can be expensive, but there is a free version called Tableau Public that you can download and use. The catch is that all of your data is universally accessible. You can publish interactive graphics using Tableau Public, but they're really they're not as responsive as something done in Flash or in HTML5. It's a very curious kind of server-based visualization where when you click on a particular entry, a particular line form, it actually sends a request to the server to replace the graphic you're looking at right now or that element with like a highlighted version of it. And so the performance is not that great. But I think that we've needed something like this for a long time. If you're going to create an interactive visualization where you don't really know what you're going to get until you've finished and you've worked on it for a month, that can be tragic if it turns out what you're trying to show doesn't really show up. And the ability to prototype your visualizations using something like Tableau is really priceless. I think there's also some interesting web-based tools that are coming online, especially for spatial data. GeoCommons is a very powerful data mapping tool that is an excellent introduction to GIS, to geographic information systems, and ways to work with data that is tagged with spatial information, that is like a state, a county, a census tract, or a city, and to show how you can blend different variables into a common space and then do analysis based on that. And it's got some very sophisticated charting forms that are built into that, and it's really a very good product, and it's free. Then in terms of sort of DIY, building bespoke visualizations using HTML and JavaScript. D3, the latest visualization JavaScript library produced by Mike Bostock, who was a PhD student at Stanford, and Jeffrey Hare, who's a professor of human-computer interaction here. It supplants an earlier library that I've talked about in the past called ProtoViz. D3 is really fundamentally a rethink of what ProtoViz did that's much more oriented towards the way that JavaScript and web pages work. And so you can quickly connect a data set to a series of marks and then create interactions around them in a way that is a little challenging to learn, but is incredibly powerful and has very good performance. And the stuff that they've done looks great. So I think D3, you're already starting to see it filter into mainstream publications. The New York Times did their Obama budget visualization with it just a week or two ago. And it's something I plan to be using more myself. In terms of web-based map visualizations, there's several different toolkits you can use. I've been using something called Open Layers, which is very popular in the academic community. But there's also leaflet.js, which is a very high-performance web mapping library that you can use to create interactive maps quite effectively. I think if you look at the most successful data visualization for news, organizations like the New York Times don't really differentiate between a graphics editor who is considered a reporter or a journalist and the rest of the newsroom in that sense. They are their own department, of course, to be fair. But I think that the idea of viewing graphics or data visualizations as the province of the art department can be a little bit problematic. I think it was okay in printed newspapers where layout and design were so intrinsic to charting and data visualization. But once you get into online, you're really starting to deal with interaction design. You're dealing with the data on such an intimate level that it requires not exactly subject matter expertise, but I think a much more profound understanding of the information, what I would call reporting or journalism. And so I realize that the organizational layout of different publications can vary. But I think what you're going to see in the online sphere is a much greater occurrence of the job title data journalist. And that might be someone who's more like what used to be a computer-assisted reporter, people who did big investigations using computer analysis. But now someone who's going to be kind of a database wrangler, someone who's familiar with charting and graphing APIs, and who maybe helps manage a set of templates or widgets that the publication uses to create interactive information graphics. Now, from an art direction standpoint, I think that there's a lot that can be done to encode certain design patterns, best ways of laying out information visually, and certainly an art director or people with design specialization could be very helpful with that. At the same time, I think a lot of these toolkits and libraries are coming with some of those principles encoded within them. Tableau, for example, they went to Linda Brewer and other specialists who really have a very clean and clear concept of how to lay out information graphics. And I think that is very much reflected in the application. But as far as like the way that the work is divided, I think that my concern would be that someone coming from an art department might be more likely to be tempted to create visualizations that stress beauty over functionality. Because they haven't been drinking the purity Kool-Aid that information graphics people have been passing around for a long time. And so I think there's a certain amount of re-education that needs to happen among design professionals in terms of how they deal with information. That the decorative elements need to be kept to a minimum. And there are certain first principles of information design that need to be observed. And I don't mean that in a disrespectful way. I think a lot of people talk past each other in newsrooms, and I think that's unfortunate. But I think there really needs to be a deep conversation.